listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, Australia's definition of terrorism and if it's still fit for purpose. The original framework was set up after the September 11 terror attacks, but now the world and Australia have changed dramatically. In 2026, the landscape of terror and radicalisation is complicated with new threats from a range of different groups, including lone actors. So do we need to look at terror in a whole new way? We'll unpack all the details in just a moment. But first, let's check the afternoon headlines this Monday, the 9th of February. Israeli President Isaac Herzog has arrived in Sydney to begin his official visit to Australia after the Bondi Beach terror attack. The President was joined by New South Wales Premier Chris Minns at the Bondi Pavilion, where he laid a wreath and also met with families of the victims from the December mass shooting.
We stood with Australian Jews, for we are one big family, and when one Jew is hurt, all Jews feel their pain. That is why I'm here today.
Mr Herzog adding the rise in anti-Semitism around the world is a global emergency. Meantime, thousands of protesters are set to gather at Town Hall in Sydney this afternoon to object to President Herzog's visit to Australia. Palestine Action Group spokesperson Josh Lees says they're not seeking any confrontation or conflict with police. At the time of recording, the group is still awaiting the outcome of a Supreme Court challenge against new powers given to police during the president's visit. Former media mogul and Hong Kong pro-democracy figure Jimmy Lai has been sentenced to 20 years in prison. In a landmark national security case, he was one of the country's most outspoken critics, with human rights groups calling the ruling a death sentence. The 78-year-old was found guilty late last year of conspiring with others to collude with foreign voices to endanger national security. His arrest was seen as a major attack on press freedom. And Bad Bunny's headlined the Super Bowl halftime show despite the objections of US President Donald Trump.
God bless America. Sea Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay.
It was the first time in the 60-year history of the NFL's championship game that the flagship entertainment has been performed largely in Spanish at a time when thousands of Central and South American immigrants have faced deportation. His 13-minute performance also included guest appearances from Lady Gaga and Ricky Martin. Donald Trump has since posted to his Truth Social website saying it was one of the worst halftime shows ever, adding, quote, "It makes no sense, is an affront to the greatness of America and doesn't represent our standards of success, creativity or excellence." Now it's time to get into our deep dive with Associate Professor Keiran Hardy from the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice on Australia's definition of terrorism. Our nation's top counter-terrorism law watchdog has launched a landmark inquiry to investigate how we define terror, how it's changed, and how we crack down on dangerous radicalisation and extremism. Keiran, thanks so much for joining us. Tell us why it's important that we look at how terrorism is defined in Australia.
Yeah, trying to decide what terrorism is almost impossible for everyone to agree on. But I think when we see these sorts of repeated tragic events in Australia, we've had the Bondi terrorist attack at the end of last year, but all these other sorts of events, and we've got protests and all sorts of things happening. And I just think there's a big question at the moment, what is terrorism? And it obviously has a lot of kind of feeling in the community and the community wanting to sort of have a say in that, or different opinions on what events should be called terrorism as well. So it's obviously a big question at the moment.
Why do you think we get answers to this really important question? Because going back in history, our definition of terrorism in Australia was in the wake of the September 11 attacks in the US, correct?
Yeah, so after 9/11, there was a Security Council resolution that said that countries around the world should enact laws to prevent terrorism, to criminalise terrorist financing and a range of other things. But the Security Council didn't actually say what terrorism is, so it was basically up to every country around the world to come up with their own definition. We didn't have any laws at that time over terrorism. We've got so many now, but at that time, this was all pretty new to a country like Australia. So we looked to the UK, and a lot of countries did, because the UK had a lot of experience with terrorism in Northern Ireland. So we basically inherited the UK's definition. We changed it a little bit, but basically inherited that. And so Canada and New Zealand in particular have also very similar definitions, but there's a range of other countries where you can see similar elements and a similar approach to defining terrorism that comes from the UK legislation.
And I understand it also centres around intent, whether there is an intent by a person or organisation to cause or carry out a terrorist act.
Yeah, and I'll just draw a distinction between intent and motive, because there's two ways that they say intent in this section. And so it's section 100.1 of the Federal Criminal Code contains the definition of a terrorist act. It says firstly that a terrorist act is conduct or a threat that intends to intimidate a population or intends to coerce or influence by intimidation a government. So that's normally what's called the intention requirement. But then probably the trickiest bit is what it also says intention, but it's commonly understood as a motive requirement. And it says there must be an intention to advance a political, religious, or ideological cause. And that's a little bit different to when we normally talk about intention in the criminal law, because it goes to the reason why somebody did an act. To be charged with murder, it only matters whether someone killed another person and they intended to kill them. They wanted that outcome. Motive, this political, religious, ideological cause element is a bit different, because it's saying, well, why did you kill the people? Was there a reason behind it? And that's why we call it motive rather than intention. And that's a really tricky thing. It's what defines terrorism in the minds of a lot of people. We have an ideological cause, something like Al-Qaeda's extreme ideology. But we're getting to the point now with different threats where it's a bit harder to say what people's ideologies are. It's easier to say, well, this is Al-Qaeda's ideology, this is Islamic State's ideology. But when we have such a range of lone actors now, we've got sort of mixed ideologies and other things, it becomes pretty difficult to say what is terrorism in the same way.
And Keiran, the biggest issue when you do have lone actors is the fact that it's almost impossible in many circumstances for authorities, anti-terrorism authorities, national security authorities to crack down on these lone actors. We know compared to 2001, many are being radicalised online and are very, very hard to track down.
Yeah, certainly when there's organised groups, you have a lot more capacity for surveillance and monitoring. I mean, that was something that came up with the Bondi attackers as well. We'll hear more details of that over time. But even generally speaking, if you have sort of just a small number of family members talking to each other without necessarily a large online presence, or you have there's just a massive material online that is extremist and so many people participating in extreme spaces, saying all sorts of horrible, awful things, it can be really difficult to predict, well, which one of those people is the most likely to do something. You might assume that there's sort of like an escalation in people's comments online to the point that they're getting more dangerous, and then they do an attack. But actually what we've seen is that some of the people who, lone actors, they can actually drop off their contact and they can be the more silent ones as well. They might have a lot of contact and then withdraw. And so those things is sort of like the absence of that is very tricky to monitor or predict as well.
Now, we know, Keiran, right now, the Independent National Security Legislation Monitor, Australia's counter-terrorism law watchdog, is undertaking actually a massive inquiry into Australia's legal definition of terrorism. Why is this important, and what outcome do you think will make a real difference in Australia?
Yeah, it's a really important inquiry, I suppose, because we are getting to the point where we're nearly, this year, 25 years on from 9/11. And our definition of terrorism in the law base comes from that time and that era. And we've seen such a shift in ideologies. We've got right-wing extremism, we've got neo-Nazis, we've got incels, sovereign citizens, all sorts of other things, nihilistic violent extremism, these other sorts of things that are appearing on the horizon as well. So the inquiry by the INSLM, the Independent Monitor's Office, is basically designed to ask, is our definition of terrorism still fit for purpose in this environment? And there'll be a lot of specific things and drafting issues and everything that the inquiry goes into. But one of the main sort of focuses of the inquiry will be, is that motive requirement still appropriate in the context of people not necessarily having a clear ideology? Lone actors, sometimes in part being driven by mental health crises. An example of that was the Bondi Westfield stabbing, not the recent terrorist attack, but a couple of years ago, that was held not to be terrorism because it was really a product in a way of a mental health crisis, even though it very much resembled terrorism to everyone in the community. So I suppose the inquiry is an opportunity for people to contribute to the inquiry as well, but for the independent monitor to determine whether the definition is still appropriate in this context of things that people think, yeah, maybe that should be called terrorism, but it wouldn't actually fit within the definition.
And why does it matter about getting the definition right? Because the end game here for all of us is to stop these terrorist acts happening, to, in regards to mental health battles, is to make sure the adequate facilities are there to help people struggling with their mental health. And also, as we know, if there is a terrorist act or a terrorist situation declared, it gives authorities and police much greater powers.
Yeah, and I think when any of these events happen, I think people approach the question, what is terrorism, from a different perspective. There's a legal question, like, is this terrorism or not, legally speaking? There's also an operational question, which is what you just touched on there, which is, well, do the authorities actually need all the extra powers and offences and so on that designating something as terrorism provides? Whereas I think the community comes at it from a different angle, which is calling something terrorism has there's a sense of justice behind that, calling out something for what it is. And so all those questions can become pretty confused in these events. So I think to the extent that we can get greater clarity on what terrorism is, I think that could, hopefully reduce the temperature of a lot of these debates whenever something happens and not make things worse in those environments. But on the other hand, there'd be an argument to say, well, murder is still a very serious offence. If it's murder for domestic violence reasons or anything else, I think there's an assumption that terrorism is more serious than other crimes. And so there's almost this sense of, well, we want to make sure that other types of crimes are treated as seriously as terrorism. But I don't think anyone in obviously terrorism has an enormous impact on society, but so does domestic violence, so does murder. And I wouldn't want anyone to think that we have to call something terrorism in order for it to be treated seriously. That's just one type of crime. And every time there's a crime, police and prosecutors are trying to determine, was this murder or manslaughter? Is this an assault causing grievous bodily harm? There's all these technical legal questions as to which offence it is. But obviously terrorism triggers a lot of sort of feeling in the community as to what it should be and whether they're being charged with the right offence. So hopefully we could get some greater clarity, maybe by amending the definition a little bit. But I mean, it's in fairly good shape. There's just a couple of bits that might put it more in line with international definitions and best practice around property damage and some other aspects of it as well.
And what difference will it make by getting that definition right, Keiran?
I honestly think a lot of it will come down to community perceptions and sort of helping solve these debates at the time when something happens. I do think that, legally speaking, I don't think the sorts of tweaks that they'll make to the definition would be very significant legally speaking. For example, one aspect of the definition that's quite controversial is including religious motive. You could take that out of the definition, and I think that could help quite a lot. There's been a lot of controversy over it. Legally speaking, I don't think it would have a huge effect. Probably the biggest thing that would change, legally speaking, would be if there was a change to the property damage limb. So currently it's quite broad and extending to serious property damage, and that's where overlaps with hate crime can get a bit confusing. But I do think there's no glaring gap, I would say, legally speaking or operationally speaking, that say the agencies don't have the power to do something. The terrorism laws are incredibly extensive. The definition is already very broad. I do think some of this comes down partly to a question of, is it tailored as well as we can possibly get it for this new threat environment? And then also, we want to make sure that sort of everyone is satisfied democratically with what we're calling terrorism, particularly when these sorts of events keep happening and that general sort of temperature of political protest and violence and everything is really, coming to the fore in a lot of debates at the moment.
We really appreciate your time, Keiran. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
That was Associate Professor Keiran Hardy from the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Griffith University. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'll be back in your feed tomorrow morning with a deep dive on how big tech is under fire for failing to protect Australian children from online sexual abuse. We'd love you to subscribe or follow us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. I'm Natarsha Belling. Thanks for your company.